Welcome to the Martin Bailey Photography Podcast. It's May 6, 2020, and this is episode 703. Today, I'm delighted to be sitting here via Zoom talking with my very good friend Nicholas Kitto, who is here to tell us about his experiences that led to the release of his new book entitled Trading Places, a photographic journey through China's former treaty ports. Nick, it's amazing to be sitting here with you. Thanks for joining me today.
Lovely to be with you again, Martin. It's been a wee while. I think it was January last year that we last had a decent contact.
Yeah. Well, I was actually touched that you were one of the few people that called and to make sure I was okay when we had that hurricane or typhoon here last year. I remember actually speaking with you on the phone in my car. My wife and I were sitting in a car park. We spent the night in a car park so that we could get out of our house because we live in a flood zone. And you emailed, and then I said, we're in a car park in a supermarket. You thought we were outside and trying to get me to get inside. So then you actually called. So I was moved by the fact that you thought enough to get on the phone and try to get me to make sure that I was safe.
Well, my dear fellow, typhoons. The one thing I really dislike about Hong Kong, I learned when I first arrived in 1983, we had a very bad Typhoon Ellen. And in those days, I was living on the 25 stories up on a building. I was at the top floor. I had a fish tank, and it had a 1-inch swell in during the storm, and the smallest windows in the bathroom were bending. You could see them flexing. Yeah. So I've always had a healthy respect of typhoons, and I know a lot of people tend to underrate them to their cost. So it was only natural. I was watching, and of course I knew it was heading straight for your front door. So wanted to make sure you weren't one of those people that were underestimating it. That was all.
Well, that's good. Thank you very much. So what we're going to do, you've just released a book which you sent me a copy of, and I need to thank you for that. Not only because it's absolutely beautiful, but I think it's probably going to be an important piece of literature and historical data for people that need to know about the treaty ports or the buildings of the treaty ports. And we're going to talk about that today in as much detail as you want. And I think that the listeners are going to be very interested in this. But of course, your angle on this was you started with the photography. But we're going to take a step back a little bit. And first of all, I'd like you to just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into photography and just a bit about your background.
Yeah. Okay. Well, a brief summary. Some of the listeners may be wondering about my surname, Kitto. It causes quite a lot of interest wherever I go, but essentially it's a Cornish name, and my family, in fact, any British, English, whatever name ending in O or OE is probably from Cornwall. Okay. And the name you'll find Kittos actually in many other places, because although it's from Cornwall, as the Cornish mines started, we were mining. Everyone was in mining, and no exception. Our family was heavily involved in mining. And as the Cornish tin mines started to close in the 1800s, miners went overseas, and our family was particularly, my great-great-grandfather was particularly fortunate to have a very good connection with an unheard of company these days called John Taylor and Sons that was based in London, and it had mining management contracts all over the world. I mean, literally all over the world. You could go to Australia, to India, to Southern Africa, to the US, to Canada, and you would find them doing mines. So we went where the work was, and the family went, and a lot of other Kittos went over the world. So you'll find Kittos popping up in all sorts of places. Wow. But my great great-grandfather ended up managing a mine in the less far away in the Isle of Man. So that's how we got to the Isle of Man.
Yeah.
And I was actually born in London, but we moved back to the Isle of Man when I was 13. But the whole thing, my interest in treaty ports came from the fact that my father was born in Tianjin, and he was born there because my grandfather was the first non-miner in the family, actually. But he was connected to the extractive industries because he was recruited by Shell as a management trainee straight from his public school on the Isle of Man, and he ended up in China. But for myself, you can imagine a 13-year-old being moved from London to the Isle of Man. I was not a happy camper, but it turned out to be the best possible move, frankly, because as it turned out, it was brilliant. And I went to a school there, same as my grandfather, and I'd always been through the usual career moves, train driver, doctor, you name it, lawyer. But I kind of settled, I suppose, typically as I became an accountant. I settled as wanted to be an accountant when I was about 13 or 14. I'm going to be a chartered accountant, is what I said. And so schooling was a bit of a pain because I wanted to get on with my accounting career.
Yeah.
And so I left school after my A-levels, which was the minimum requirement. And I eventually qualified as a chartered accountant on the Isle of Man, and made some very good friends, lifelong friends during that process. But in those days, this is 1977, it was typical for a newly qualified accountant to go abroad for a couple of years. And so I wanted to go to Africa because, of course, I'd been influenced by the film Zulu at an early age, and I'd read all Wilbur Smith books and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But I also told the headhunter that I kind of wanted to go to Hong Kong because I knew there was a family connection with China, obviously, but I didn't know much about it. And mainland China in the 70s was pretty well closed, certainly for working purposes. It was very difficult unless you had a Chinese roots. And so I ended up in Nairobi, and Martin, I tell you that those 2 years, I know people look back and they always remember the good things, but I can promise you, because I remember thinking before I left, these 2 years were simply fantastic. The career was great, the country was great, and of course the photography was great.
Yeah.
And so that it was terrific. And then I went to, for historical reasons, the Nairobi practice was part of the Middle East firm. And I went up. It's no good staying in Africa if you were working for a Middle East firm. And I had no intention of I had no desire to work in the Middle East, but I really enjoyed the firm. So I went up and worked there for 3 years. And I loved the firm and I loved the work, but I just didn't really like the place. And so there was an opening in Hong Kong for a technical and training manager. And so I came in the the Hong Kong practice. And so I moved to Hong Kong in 1983.
Okay.
But as for the photography side, that goes back. The interest was born when I was at boarding school. I was sent to boarding school at the age of 8, which was quite young, fairly typical. Now, that my mother tells me, or my parents tell me, that the reason I was sent to boarding school was because the primary school, the headmaster there, was convinced that I was going to turn to crime. I was going to be recruitment fodder for the gangsters in the East End of London. This, of course, kind of impressed me. I mean, luckily they didn't tell me, because I might have thought about not being an accountant by then. But anyway, off I went to boarding school, and to a lovely school, fantastic school in Seaford, Sussex, which was the prep school capital of England in those days, and there were about 5 or 6 schools in a square mile. And the deputy headmaster, Major Brow, he was a very keen photographer, and he had a film Hasselblad. He had your traditional Hasselblad camera, which was, the camera to have, certainly in those days. And every weekend he would do some photography and process and print it. And Sunday night was his night to go around all the dormitories and turn the lights out. And he'd bring 3 or 4 of his color, sometimes a couple of black and white prints that he had photographed, developed and printed that weekend. And of course, there was school on the Saturdays. And I thought, wow, this is amazing.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get a camera. And in those days, I couldn't swim. So that first summer holiday, I said, well, look, Mum, I'll learn to swim if you buy me a camera.
That's an accountant. He's trying to figure out what you can get for out of the deal.
A bit of a deal. So I did that, and I duly doggy paddled my width of the swimming pool and was bought a camera, and then it moved on from there. They bought me I don't know what it was, but it was obviously a film. But it was kind of difficult to use, and a few years it went out of use. I've still got the negatives. And then I was given one Christmas in my teens an Instamatic 25 Kodak with that lovely slide film, that wonderful slide film, and the colors still hold today. And it just slowly grew from there. And then finally, as a present to myself for qualifying as an accountant, I bought a Pentax MX.
Oh, nice.
And then I went to Africa, and it just built from there. And that's how I got hooked on photography. Yeah,
brilliant. So the Pentax, was that a medium format camera as well, or a 35 millimeter?
No, so little. I've got one of still here. Pentax MX was a small 35 millimeter. I think I had 1 or 2 lenses. Of course, I couldn't afford much more than that.
Okay.
And then I in Africa, I sold it and moved on to I bought a Canon AE, which I kind of liked but didn't really like, and then Canon brought out. There you go.
Got one behind me. We're not going to be showing the video for this, but you can see an AE on the shelf behind me there.
Yeah. Then the Canon A1, I think it was, came out. Is it
actually, that's what this is. It's an AE1. It was released in around 83, which is when about the time you're talking. So it's exactly that.
This is the camera, the Canon. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay.
The
Canon A1 was the first camera that had a lot of electronics in it. This is the original one that I had, and
that's amazing that you've still got it.
Oh, I love it. I tried using it not so long ago, but the shutter has sort of got humidity's got to it, and I took it to Canon, and they said, "Look, very sorry, but we just don't carry the parts anywhere. You could buy another one secondhand, and we could, if the shutter's good." Anyway, I left it. But
this one I've got here, I put a film through that a few years ago, and every 3 or 4 frames the shutter didn't work. It was and it's probably because we both live in like semi-tropical countries. The humidity in Hong Kong and Japan are not good for camera gear, so it's not surprising that that's the thing that's happening. The very fine leaves of metal in that shutter, they just don't respond well to humidity.
Yeah, and I think this one actually had a cloth. I don't think it. Anyway, I'll perhaps not try and speculate what the shutter was made of. It's a bit old. So anyway, sadly, I can't use that. But the MX, I occasionally take out.
Yeah,
it still works.
That's brilliant.
Yeah,
I've been, because I've I've got into developing my own film as well. I mean, I've actually developed a roll of 120 film. It's over there drying.
Yeah.
You probably can't see it from there. But I've got a renewed interest in film, and so when you said Pentax, I was thinking there's some really nice 6x7 centimeter medium format Pentax cameras. Yeah. And there was one popped up in the secondhand store this morning, but I'm thinking, yeah, well, coronavirus is taking away a lot of the the revenue this year, so I probably shouldn't be buying new secondhand cameras. So, but the yearning is still there. So brilliant. So that's how you got into photography. You did you back then when you were in Nairobi, were you getting out into nature as well, or what sort of things were you photographing?
Yeah, now here's a lesson for some people anyway, certainly a lesson for me, but I did a lot of wildlife photography, and to my great fury with myself, I did very little else. I've got no I've got hundreds of photographs of lions chewing up zebras and these cheetahs chasing after this, that, or vultures doing whatever, gathered round a carcass. But I've got maybe a dozen shots of Nairobi as it was. And I've got the worst thing, Martin, is I've got no people shots.
Yeah.
And I've got a shot of my cat and my fish tank, but I haven't got a single photograph of my colleagues or anything, and that's a great regret. That's a great regret.
I understand. I mean, people often say, and I do more now than I did, but living in Tokyo, it's like one of the street photography metropolises of the world. It's an amazing place for street photographers, and I don't do very much street photography at all. But I think the thing is I love looking at street photography, and I do enjoy doing it more now, especially with the film. I love going out with the rollie and just sort of wandering around with that. But it's what you're interested in. You put your time, your photography time, especially when you're working in another career. You put your time that you have for essentially what's a hobby into the areas that you're most interested in. So that was obviously what you were most interested in at the time, and got all of your energy. So
I think you're being very kind to let me off the hook a bit, Martin. But
no, it's I understand, and I think, but it's also nice to to think back and think what you could have done, and regrets aren't always a bad thing. But there's a Japanese poet. I forget, might be Terayama Shuji, who said something that translates into, don't look back, there are no dreams behind you. And I really like that, because that's my translation. I've never actually seen what it's translated to, but I think that regrets and looking back on things are good, but look at what you've done with your photography since then. You've covered so many other great things. So it's
that's a great way to look at it. It's the correct way to look at it. And of course, thanks to today's mobile phones and so on. I mean, I've got scores of photographs of people now, hundreds of photographs of people now. But I do miss, and in the Middle East, when I was there, it was harder to do photography, particularly as I was in Saudi. They were very sensitive about it. So I didn't do much there either, although, excuse me, I had a bit of a break because our chief executive officer knew I was very keen on photography, and he asked me to do a whole series of photographs around some of the offices for their recruitment brochure, which I did, and that had the benefit of getting me out of Saudi for a little bit of a break as well, which was nice.
Yeah.
Although I as I say, I enjoyed being in the Middle East. I made the best of it, but I wasn't sorry I was sad to leave the people, and not just my colleagues, but the people there as well, the local people there. But I'm very happy I'm in Hong Kong. Although we could perhaps do without some of the troubles at the moment. But,
you've had a stormy year or so, haven't you? Like politically, not as well as physically.
Yeah, dear, oh dear. Anyway.
So tell us about the treaty ports and how you know what they are and how that initial interest formed as you got into photographing them.
Okay, as I sort of warned a bit earlier on before we started, it's a big topic, but I think I can fast forward to say the 1820s and summarize where we're at, as it were. By then, the East India Company had taken over or conquered, if you like, or absorbed, in many cases voluntarily, absorbed much of India. It had naturally started before then trading, looking for other areas to trade in. And the Dutch were dominant in the Spice Islands. They were dominant in spice, and the East India Company tried to get into that, but they were kind of squeezed out, and it wasn't viable. So the next best alternative was China. And so by the 1800s, that of course, then they discovered tea there. And the Brits became absolutely hooked, as indeed did other Westerners, because the American colonies at the time, and then the US also liked their tea. And so this became a big import, and it was all sourced in China, because although tea was sort of grown in places in India and what have you, the quality was nothing like what they found in China. So by the 1800s, the East India Company was dominating trade in China, and other countries were coming in as well. The Americans were big, the French, the Dutch, of course, came up from Indonesia, as it's now known, or the Dutch East Indies, as it was then, but then in 1757. The Emperor China said, right, I'm tired of all these people moving around all the ports, and it's inconvenient and it's disruptive. So he said, right, every foreigner must now trade in from Guangzhou or Canton, and Canton is perhaps the best known, and they still use Canton. It's still the Canton trade fairs twice a year, but everyone was confined to Canton. So there was no foreign trade outside Canton. And of course, the East India Company dominated that market. But as I said, there were plenty of others involved. Then we have to sort of move on to what was happening, that an awful lot of tea was coming out. And the Chinese were interested in a lot of the British products and other products such as cotton, woolen products, and more later the machinery, the technical knowledge and equipment that was coming out. But nevertheless, the trade was heavily favoring the Chinese with the quantities of tea. Then we come to the sticky, but it has to be mentioned, subject of opium. Now, I could go on at length about opium. I'm not going to, because it ought to be put into the context, though. Opium can be eaten, it can be smoked, and more latterly, of course, it's injected. And the trouble is, today, people think of opium, they think of heroin, they think of needles, they think of the ghastly drug problem or the opioid problem, especially in the US. But in those days, it was kind of used for medicinal purposes. China smoked, the Chinese smoked it. In the West, it was drunk or eaten, as it's sometimes referred to. And it was normally best known as laudanum, which was a medicine. And terrifyingly, as it turns out, laudanum was being used for young infants with teething problems and things. They'd rub a bit on their gums and what have you. And it was used as a sedative and all the rest of it, the same sort of thing the smoke gave you. It was becoming a problem not just in China who was smoking it, but also everywhere else. But it wasn't such an obvious problem. The biggest problem in those days, in Britain anyway, was probably gin. And of course, alcohol is also a drug, and it's also addictive. But let's get back to let's not talk about too much about the rights and wrongs of opium. I deliberately avoid that subject because there are lots of books, and I could even maybe later recommend a short book that leads up to the so-called opium wars. But what happened is that it was becoming, once opium was, the real problem was that opium was used as a kind of as a relax, as a way to relax, and it was unaffordable to most people in China. It was very much a rich man's drug, like a good, decent bottle of wine, if you like, although obviously slightly different. But there was in India, where the best opium was manufactured by the East India Company, independent growers started growing it and exporting it to China. And in order to try and get these people out of the market, the East India Company started mass producing opium. So it brought the prices right down, and that made it cheaper for everyone else, whether it be Chinese or whoever. And so suddenly what you found is that opium was now starting to be bought in China in massive quantities. And it was, the balance of trade switched, because now tea, the value of tea that was being bought, was not enough to pay for the opium that was coming in. So China's main problem at that time was the balance of payments deficit, and the silver was literally pouring out of the country. That was the primary concern. Of course, there was the health concerns, but opium didn't really become a big problem in China until it was legalized in 1858. And what happened then is that it was grown in China in such large quantities that the companies the foreign companies that were importing it from India, it was no longer viable business, so they left the business completely. So it became very much a China specific problem, and it did balloon into a major health issue for them there. But anyway, so I digressed a little bit, but going back to, let's go to 1839. Now, in Canton or Guangzhou, as I've said, every foreigner was restricted to that area to trade in. And Commissioner Lin was appointed by the emperor to stamp out the opium business. Now, the opium business in Canton there was material, but it wasn't the only thing that was happening. There were lots of British firms, American firms importing cotton, woolen products, machinery, clocks, technology, you name it. In order to stamp out the trade, he confiscated all the, it's more complicated than this, but in effect, he confiscated the opium and destroyed it. Now, if he'd left it at that, it would have been fine. But what happened is that the two things. Firstly, the chief government official, British government official in Canton, a fellow called Captain Charles Elliot, issued promissory notes to pay back all the British dealers for the opium that had been confiscated. Now, Charles Elliot himself was against the opium trade, as was the British Parliament. Everyone was, except for these traders. And they were material number, but not the largest, necessarily the largest number of people there. And so, but Commissioner Lim closed down all the trade, and that caused problems. So you had people in Liverpool complaining that, and then it became a problem of these promissory notes and the British government having to pay for it. They couldn't afford it because they'd only just finished paying off the costs of abolishing slavery and the slave trade in the colonies. So they couldn't pay for it. And all the other trade had been stopped. So there was never mind the opium issue. It became a question of, how can we allow foreign power to stop all of our trade and everything. So anyway, that's how the first Opium War started, because the British essentially, by a very narrow vote, it would have taken only 5 people in Parliament to vote differently, to vote to send in a small number of naval ships and a small number of troops. And the Chinese had really little chance of winning that war because their army and navy was desperately behind. And so they lost. And the subsequent treaty opened up not only did it give Hong Kong to Britain, but it opened 5 ports, which became known as treaty ports in China, and Shanghai and Guangzhou and 3 others as well. But the thing that's then everyone realized was that it was quite easy to get what you wanted from China by using force. And so subsequently, this was the Treaty of Nanking was signed in 1842, and subsequently, every little excuse, whether it was a German or the British again, or the French, every time they wanted another port opening to trade from, they would find some excuse and threaten China. And China would normally back down. Sometimes there was the occasional bun fight, literally, small battles if necessary. And China, understandably, talks about the unequal treaties because, if you can imagine, I'm from Britain, so if you can imagine, well, say China coming along now to the Isle of Man and saying, right, well, we want to take over this place and we want to trade. Perhaps I'll be giving them an idea now, but we want to trade from the Isle of Man and we want our laws to apply here, and you're just going to have to get on with it. Now that's essentially what was happening in China. They were unequal treaties. If you want to have a silver lining of the whole thing, it did bring down the corrupt Qing dynasty, the last of the imperial dynasties, and it heralded the revolution and eventually, of course, you end up with the Second World War and then the Civil War, which of course led to the current situation. The one thing that going back to 1839, 1840, Captain Charles Elliot said is that there would never, if there hadn't been opium, there would never have been a war, because that's the simple answer. So it's right to blame the opium for it, but it was far more complicated, and opium was a far bigger issue than just in China. It was an issue everywhere, as was alcohol, of course.
Wow.
So I've gone on at length, and I'm sure there are others that could have explained it far better. But that's how the treaty ports, that's how it all arose.
For me, that was great just to listen through that, because I'd no idea what was going on in that era, and the treaty ports. The first time I'd heard of a treaty port was from when we first met, which was probably around 2015 or 16 when you...
15, correct.
Was it 15? When you joined the... I think the first tour that you joined was the Hokkaido landscape trip, yeah?
Correct.
Then you started talking about the book, and you would always do the air quotes, telling me, "Oh, the book's almost finished, Martin." And I heard that for 5 years until you recently sent me this copy, and finally you finished it. And so, we've traveled a number of times together since. You've joined, I think, 3 of my tours, and including twice on the landscape trip, the Hokkaido landscape trip, and Namibia as well. So
that's correct.
Yeah. So we've spent a lot of quality time together, and I've always been always admired your knowledge of the things that you do, but this, the treaty ports was something that I'd not heard of, and so it's great for me to sit and listen to that history. But also, I mean, tell us a little bit about how you got into actually going out and photographing them. Rather than, the history is interesting, but how did you lead? What led into your sort of going out and photographing these ports?
Alas, by now, Martin, you should know that there's always a long story.
That's fine.
This is no exception. I've got to go back to November 1996, and I'd always go home and see my parents, and my parents were separated then. And November 1966, I was having supper with my father on the Isle of Man, and I knew he'd been born in Tianjin, and I knew that my grandfather had worked for Shell there in I may use the initials APC at some point, which is Asiatic Petroleum Company, which is one of the two Shell subsidiaries there. He worked for the north part, which was sort of Shanghai, Yangtze River and up as you go up. But that's pretty well all I knew. And I'll come back to it later if we've got time. But that was basically it. But the other side, it was his wife, my grandmother, whose family I only quite recently discovered was very involved in China. They'd been in China since 1865, and we had no knowledge of that. But that's another issue. But in November 1996, I said, Pa, I'm 2 weeks from now, I'm going out with my clients in their private jet, as it happened. Very nice too, thank you. To their plant in the economic zone in Tianjin, and I said, you were born there? And he said, yeah. And I remember his words. He said, wouldn't it be a laugh if you could find our old house? And we thought, oh, come on, what have we had since that's what, 1925 to 1930 you were there. We've had countless sort of warlord problems during that time, and then there's the Second World War, and then there's the Civil War, and then there's the most damaging actually of the whole lot was the Cultural Revolution. But although he was only about 5 or 6 when he left, he drew me a rough map of the location, and it was quite easy to find on the road because it was a racecourse road, which is still called Racecourse Road in Chinese, and it was on a apex of a corner where 2 other roads joined in a V, and it was right where on the point of the V on that road, and it was so it was almost a crossroads. And the entrance of the front door of the house was up steps on the left. And there was some French windows going into the front garden. And again, I found the house. I found the house. It wasn't difficult. On the way back from the lube plant, we saw somewhere where it could have been. So after a wonderful dinner where we had 12 rounds of Mau Tai, goodness me, I sort of, I say I walked, probably staggered a bit, but I jumped into a cab with one of my colleagues who spoke Mandarin, and we went and we found the house, and we went and we knocked on the door, and of course the house was occupied by several families, but someone was just coming out, and he said yes, because the key thing on that, in the center of that V had been US Army barracks, back in the 20s and so on. And he said, yes, you're quite right. The US Army barracks were over there. My mother used to work there. So that was it. So I went and got up very early the next morning because we were flying off to Shanghai that day, and took some photos, sent them off to my father, and direct hit. And so next year, when I was going back, I had another challenge, and that was to find the country club, which we will look at shortly. Yeah. Well, fairly shortly, given things, but and thanks to, and I had an old photo of it, and thanks to the driver that I hired from the hotel, me and my clients, we went off, and he found this place, and I've had a picture of me standing this is 1997, a year later.
Hmm.
And so this is how I started to get interested. And I went back several times, well, a few times to Tianjin. Famously, I took my father back there in 2004. And you couldn't believe our good luck, because his house, which he hadn't been in since he was 6, not only was it still there, but suddenly it had a bar in the ground floor. So he went and had a couple of G&Ts in his old living room. And of course he says, God, it's got a bit small, hasn't it? And I said, well, don't ask me, but of course you've got a bit bigger, Pa, so obviously. And of course we tried to get upstairs, but it was in a different family and it was locked. And then the next day, that evening, we went to an old restaurant that he remembered when he was younger. It was fantastic, German restaurant, Kiesling's. And the next day, we taxied out to the country club, where he'd never really gone inside because children were not allowed in, but he remembered skating on the lake. He remembered being able to sign a chit for on his father's account for Coca-Cola or something in the small shop by the cafe by the lake. And there was a very understanding caretaker. Now, this is something, it probably applies in most Asian countries, in Japan as well. China is wonderful. If you mention, it doesn't matter where you come from, if your father or relative was working there under the auspices of these unequal treaties or whatever they thought of them, it doesn't matter. It's family, your family. And the caretaker, once she discovered that my father's parents had been in the club and that he'd been in the grounds, it was closed because it was in 2004 and it was just after SARS, and the grounds were still closed. But she grabbed this huge keyring and gave us a tour. Oh, wow. Martin, I tell you, I kid you not, it was identical. It really was amazing. The billiard tables were still there. They were covered in dust and mud, but the door said billiard room. The bar was still there, and it was all very tatty and dirty and everything. And we went into the main dining room, and I was bouncing on the floor, and I thought, my God, this floor's going to collapse. But of course, later I discovered it was the first sprung dance floor to be introduced into China. And my father was, as you can understand, we were nearly in tears because it was just, and there was an indoor swimming pool, which you can see now in the book. It was a ghastly, just a concrete. It was as it had been built. It was a 1920s concrete indoor swimming pool. It was as simple as that. It wasn't as flashy as it looks now. And there was the kind of remains of something that looked like a squash court, and there was again the remains of something like a bit like a bowling alley. Which I
remember the bowling alley in the book as well. Yeah,
yeah,
that's amazing.
And so oh my God, did talk about lucking out. It was terrific. It was terrific. And then we went off to Beijing after that, and it was just a fantastic trip. But at that time, we also looked round the city, because we weren't staying in the Astor Hotel, which again we'll talk about later. But we were staying in another hotel nearby, and we started looking around, and I noticed all these old Western style buildings, and so that's what set things going. And then I was due to retire at the end of 2007. Now I need to introduce my very good friend Robert Neild. He's also an accountant. We grow on trees, us guys. And he was much more into history and the Victorian history. And at that time, he was actually president of the Hong Kong branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. And I said to him, just in the last few weeks I was working, how about we pop up to Tianjin and I'll show you the house where my father was born in. I'll show you the country club and we can look around. And so we did that. And I remember we were there for 3 days, 3 nights. And our last evening, we were having a buffet dinner in a hotel, and we were thinking, there's a lot of stuff here, a lot of buildings here. And of course, we all knew, because we'd been to Shanghai, that the Shanghai Bund still had its surviving buildings. So this is kind of how it started to gel. And I think Robert by then was actually more advanced in his thoughts, but by a wonderful coincidence, a few weeks later, Robert was at a New Year's Eve bash, and one of his friends there was also a historian, and she'd organized a series of books on China for a joint publishing, which is a local Hong Kong publisher. And she was looking for someone to write, as part of the series, a book on the first 5 treaty ports and how they arose. And she asked Robert, would you be interested? Oh, yes, he was interested. And of course, suddenly we had a project.
And he needed some photographs for it.
And he needed some photographs for it. But of course, I had a lot of catching up to do on the knowledge front, and Robert's had a lot more resources and maps. But I did my own research, and the one common thing we both noticed very quickly is that if we were going to say a city called Wuhu, how do we find out about Wuhu? Well, you have to go through all the countless books we've got on treaty ports, and you go to the index and look up Wuhu, and you go through each page, whether it's page 100 or page 250, making notes on Wuhu. There was no single publication on each treaty port.
Oh, wow.
So that's what we both recognized. There was so Robert's first book was published in 2010, and it's got a lot of my photographs in it. And I helped him as well with, I did a lot of scanning of stuff and touching up stuff. And it was really good fun. It was good fun. And so this is how we started. And then that led on to his second book, which was published in 2015, which was a blow by treaty port, and not just treaty ports, but every single, it's correctly entitled China's Foreign Places. So it was the settlements, there's rights to land, there's ports of call, there's all that stuff.
Wow. So then at that point, you'd already been involved in these first 2 books. What was the drive behind, you sat back and said, I'm going to do, because I imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, I imagine that the book that I've got in front of me right now, Trading Places, is probably a bigger book than the ones that were already there from Robert.
Yeah. Well, Robert's is extensive on the history of the era and of each treaty port. He's done it port by port, so you can, if you're going there, and this is kind of the pictorial version, but
that's what I was thinking.
It's not. I haven't covered nearly as many, because we had approximately 51 visits, and it was great fun. It was great fun. Each visit was terrific, and of course, being a new professional photographer, I took my tripods to our first trips. I remember our first trip was first serious trip was to the Shandong province and to Qingdao, which was not actually one of the first 5 treaty ports, which we were kind of concentrating.
Is that
on.
over on the East Coast?
Yeah.
That's they call that Qingdao here in Japan. It's the Green Island. That's
correct. Yeah. So that pronunciation is closer to the original.
I see.
Spelling pronunciation.
Okay. Yeah.
That was quite big for Japan. Japan had its influence there.
They have the Qingdao beer as well.
Oh, glorious. Yeah. Glorious. And many an evening, because what we did each day is and it started, we would have breakfast at 8, and we'd be out not later than 9 in the morning, and we'd go straight through. Yeah. And then we'd try and be back by 6, cocktail time, old chap. Yeah. And by then we'd not eaten anything, so we'd go to the hotel bar or the nearest bar, and we would drink plenty of rehydrate with draft Qingdao, and there's few beers better than draft Qingdao, and a fistfuls of peanuts, of course, groundnuts.
Fistfuls of peanuts. Yeah, to make up for the lunch.
Yeah, and of course, in those days, I took a tripod, and I was meticulous, and I even used the tilt and shift. Oh boy, that soon changed. Tripod just slowed us down, and we couldn't. I stopped using tripod after the first trip. I always took a tripod, but I never seldom took it out with me. I would use it for the occasional nighttime shot, or sometimes I would get up very early if it was the summer months and do something I really wanted a good detailed shot on. But we didn't. I didn't use the tripod. So it was handheld, which of course meant that if you want to ask me what I was generally, my general setting was normally ISO 400 and sometimes 200 if it was bright, and f11 if I was lucky, and if the shutter speed was okay.
Okay, so we went on to talk for another hour after this, so I'm going to split this conversation into 2 parts and release the next part early next week. So I have put together a post that is at mbp.ac/703, and that has the 10 images that we will talk about next week embedded in that, because we reference some of the locations in our conversation to this point as well. So I'll put the images in both posts. This first part will be at 703 and the second part at mbp.ac/704. So thanks very much for listening today. If you enjoy this podcast, please share a link with your friends. Subscribe in iTunes or your favorite podcast program to ensure uninterrupted delivery. If you have a moment to rate the podcast or leave us a review in iTunes, that helps to keep us relevant in the huge number of podcasts out there now. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn, and links to everything that I'm up to are at martinbaileyphotography.com, so do drop by and take a look. I'll be back next week with that second part, but in the meantime, you take care and have a great week, whatever you're doing. Bye bye.